Welcome to Open to Debate. I'm Nick Gillespie, and I'll be guest hosting today's episode. The 2024 election has been about the craziest in American history. With just days to go, the polls are neck and neck, polarization is through the roof, and all of us are wondering not just who's going to be the next president of the United States, but what sort of country we'll be living in come January. It's a lot of uncertainty, no matter what your political persuasion, and it seems like a perfect time then to see what we can learn from people who excel at navigating uncertainty. So today, instead of a debate, I'm sitting down with Nate Silver. Nate is a leading political forecaster and the founder and former editor-in-chief of FiveThirtyEight, who writes Silver Bulletin at Substack. He's also a former professional poker player and the author of the best-selling book, On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything, a book where he discusses what we can learn from professional risk takers about navigating uncertainty in the 21st century. Nate, thanks for joining Open to Debate. Yeah. All right. So it is good to see you, sir.
Absolutely.
On the Edge, is it still on the New York Times bestseller list?
We have 5 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, so we'll take that. We'll take it. It's above expectations.
You don't want to be showy, right? All right, we're going to talk about the election, but first let's talk about the book, which is an incredible way of talking about life in today's America. Walk me through the major way you organize the book, where you describe two types of people or two modes of being, the river and the village. What are the main features of each, and why are they in opposition to one another?
So the village is the East Coast establishment. It's media, it's academia, Harvard University, the New York Times. I did an event at the New York Public Library last week. Great venue, great event, but that's the village, right? It's like kind of old money. It's social, but also risk averse, and also communitarian in a way, or community oriented. In the village, you're afraid of offending people. You're afraid of getting canceled, saying the wrong thing, and so forth. Whereas the river is the world of, the colloquial way to put it is like degenerate gamblers, basically. Yeah. But it's people who
on water. And on water. And degenerates on water, that's even better.
It's kind of more of a river is a long thing, right? Like a river, you get like different sub-communities that kind of have similarities and differences. Silicon Valley is different than Wall Street, or than kind of poker and like gambling proper. But it's people who fuse being very analytical with being very competitive. And these two things put together are a very high variance skill set. You either tend to win big or lose big, but as our economy becomes more financialized, so quantitative things, finance, tech, large language models are made of just like matrix algebra. I'm simplifying a lot here, right? That skill set becomes more and more favored in society, but we've also seen the river become more politicized. It used to be that they would say, I'm in the gray tribe, I'm apolitical, we'll do our own thing in Silicon Valley, and if Washington tries to regulate us, then we'll fight back, but otherwise leave us alone, we're out here in California, 3,000 miles away. But now certain parts of the river, and I want to be clear, the average Riverian is probably like a moderate Democrat. They're college educated, they kind of want to be left alone, probably a little bit libertarian, but you are getting like the Elon Musks, in particular Elon Musk, yeah. and Peter Thiel was early on the Trump train, and Mark Andreessen and people like that. And so this kind of predicted clash in the book, as I'm kind of finishing the book late last year, earlier this year, it kind of becomes a reality where when you see Bill Ackman leading the charge against the presidents of MIT, Penn, which other school? Harvard. Yeah. Just a little school by the Charles River. That's like the actual clash coming to fruition more and more. Elon's a complicated character in that like, he is way more impulsive, I think, than you typically want in someone from the river, where you're supposed to be arm's length analytical. You're supposed to be, fox and hedgehogs, which was in my previous book, but you're supposed to be fox-like, meaning you gain a lot of perspective from different things. You're not going all in, you're not too ideological, and Elon violates that part. But certainly you have this clash that's becoming more and more explicit.
When you identify yourself as a Riverian, right, as a person of the river, you're a degenerate gambler. Right, by your own admission.
I don't want to say how much was involved in my fantasy basketball draft, but
when did you first kind of see yourself as part of the river?
When I was 13, I started like a little betting pool in my neighborhood where people would get a spreadsheet every week and like actually physical. I'm old enough where you physically print it out, right? And like fill in the NFL games. My friend Ray cheated one time because he submitted the thing late and he got like all 14 games right. I'm like, Ray, if you had gotten 12 out of 14, then this wouldn't be so suspicious. But 14 out of 14, come on, Ray, you can't be doing that. The stakes for $5, so whatever. But yeah.
What are the aspects of the river do you most identify in yourself?
I mean, those two things. I am certainly good with math and things like that, and very analytically oriented, and good at the phenomenon known as decoupling. We're able to separate out one component from another. So the example I give is that if you're able to say, I really dislike the Chick-fil-A president's stance on gay marriage, but they make really good sandwiches, right? That's decoupling. So I think I'm pretty good at parsing things into different parts, but also I've just always been really competitive. This is the most predictable thing ever. If you see my Twitter feed, I did like debate team in high school. I get a kick out of poker tournaments and testing your mettle.
But you had a foot in the village. I mean, you grew up as a son of university people. You went to
university presidents who bought the New York Times, and they'd walk down to buy the New York Times every day before you had like home delivery.
Are you a typical? I mean, are they kind of born on the river, or are they born in the village and then migrate to the river because they're not getting what they want out of life in the village?
I think there probably is a genetic component.
One of the things that I think your book clarifies, which I hadn't thought of in these terms, is the analytic level of people in the river. So like somebody like Donald Trump, and it all gets super confusing very quickly, right?
Yeah.
Because he is brash and a kind of norm breaker, but he obviously grew up with money and went to Penn, all of this. But he's not a river person. Is that correct?
He's not. I mean, he has some things. Donald Trump understands strategy in kind of like a game theory way. He understands reciprocity and that kind of tactical thing. But yeah, most people are not in either. My friend calls it the wilderness. So these are the rival 1% communities. Right. They're both privileged. They're both elites. But they increasingly are battling for cultural supremacy.
How, we're in very polarized times. Would it be helpful if the river and village kind of called a truce, or would that be especially if they're elites, would it be even worse for the 99% or the 98% if these two 1% groups teamed up?
No, part of what I'm trying to encourage with this book is for there to be more shared and kind of common understanding, because I think the village critiques of the river are kind of true, and vice versa.
You mentioned something in the book that was interesting when you talked to Peter Thiel, who is a river person in your scheme. When you suggested at one point that some or much of his success might just be luck or contingent, not like, oh, he's just got lucky, but that some part of it is just chance.
I mean, he had kind of a metaphysical objection to it, which is, so I asked him, it's also like a warm-up softball question, right? First question in the interview. I'm like, Peter, if you ran the world, simulated the world 1,000 times, how often would you be in a position roughly like the one you're in now, right? And most people know to be like, well, I'm so lucky, I got lucky at this juncture and that juncture, I'm a pretty talented guy, but like I got lucky. But Peter took half an hour to answer the question, brought up like Joseph Conrad and things like that. I mean, he's a very literate and thoughtful guy. He's not so impulsive. His objection was that like either the world's deterministic, in which case 100 or 1,000 times out of 1,000, or otherwise it's like a poorly specified problem.
Or
it's just a question of how many
Calvinist,
things.
Right? He believes in predetermination.
I think he probably does. He's quite religious, and also if you wake up, like so, a couple of years ago I got 97th place or 87th place out of 10,000 people in the World Series of Poker, which was fun. I started to think like, what if I won the World Series of Poker when writing a book about gambling? Wouldn't that be pretty weird, right? Wouldn't you start to say, is this like a simulation, or am I preordained or something? Because like inherently as a Bayesian, that gets like pretty weird if you like actually won the main event of the World Series of Poker. So if you're Elon Musk or you're Joe Biden or Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, one of the most powerful people in the world, it's got to be very strange. And I think people feel like the rules don't matter anymore, and you can do and say whatever you want. It's a very different approach than the typical like calculating politician.
Let me ask as a question about the split between the river and the village. Nobody really wants to live in the village, right? Or nobody wants to be part of the village. They might want to live there. But we all want to see ourselves as the gambler floating down the Mississippi River and having adventures, right?
I think people, you and I, Nick, or people in this room, I don't think there are a lot of strivers out there. I have an instinctive revulsion to like the strivery people.
What do you mean by that?
They just want the do-gooder types, right? They want to advance in their career and gain social standing by doing things the conventional way quite well. You know, I'm gay, and like gay men have this kind of paradox where on the one hand they can be countercultural and rebellious, on the other hand they're trying to be normal and like kind of fit in and be like the bestest boy in the world kind of thing. And so I see that in one of my communities as well. But there are a lot. I mean, go to DC. There's a lot of strivers in DC.
Where did that come from in you? And you went to University of Chicago, which has some kind of reputation, and then you did finance or consultancy, right? And then you started doing all this stuff kind of on the down low, right? Where you were writing anonymously or pseudonymously at FiveThirtyEight. Where did that come from in you?
I mean, it probably skipped a generation. My parents are both. So the term we use for someone who is neurotic and risk averse in the poker world is a nit, N-I-T. So my parents were fairly nitty. They wouldn't let me have like chocolate at night, for example. So maybe that inspired it in part. But if you skip a generation, I mean, my like grandma was a big gin rummy player. My great grandfather committed very innovative forms of arson and insurance fraud, right? My great uncle was one of the few Jewish oil barons. Not an oil baron, he was a geologist who was very good at like finding oil deposits and wound up working for a big oil company in Colorado. And go to like the Rattlesnake Boot Ranch and like with the other guys in a building up in Denver, be the only Jewish guy there. And so, so there is something that I think is probably genetic and just the dice roll that came up.
Okay, you take risks, but you also try to be rational and analytic. Do what are the strategies you use to manage your risk taking and to make sure that your personal biases are not taking you into a place you shouldn't be?
I mean, so in the context of election forecasting, one thing is being aware that you have biases. That's a good first step, right? With election forecasting, the advantage of having a model is that you make up the rules in advance, and there is room for interpretation in how you build a model. I mean, these models say different things. But so you're not tempted by your subjective emotional response in the moment. You agree to a process and not just pure ad hocery.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the model will, the model says what it says. And I chose to build a model how I did, so I would not have to make decisions 13 days before the election. Oh, I don't like this poll. I don't like that poll. Because it's all just partisan motivated reasoning.
Is this a kind of broader shift, at least in certain parts of society, away from that kind of subjective understanding of things? I think of Moneyball, where there's the old time baseball scouts where it seems to be all hunch and kind of intuition. There's a newer way of looking at it where it's like we're going to try and extract something kind of objective, realizing you can never get fully there. So is what you're doing, is that happening throughout society?
Oh, it's happened.
Yeah.
That's the dominant paradigm, and this is a Peter Thiel thing also. He's like, well, actually, now moneyballing everything is the norm, and so maybe the edges come from understanding where there are flaws in the models. Maybe they come from intuition. Maybe in poker they come from like physically reading or emotionally reading another opponent when you're in a hand with them, which I think might be true. I mean, the default is that everything is optimized and analytical. I mean, there might be little tidewater areas where the river hasn't conquered quite yet, but like it's a default way of like organizing society now. Things are more optimized than.
Why do you think that happened, and how much of that is tied to technology that allows it to happen?
I think capitalism is very efficient at optimizing things. I think people leave a data trail here. There are asymmetries when we leave a kind of cloud of data everywhere we go. We leave a lot of hints, and smart, powerful companies use algorithms to help get us to pay more of something or manipulate us in certain ways. So I worry about that a lot. It's good for corporate bottom lines, but like corporate bottom lines are increasing. There are record corporate profits at the same time you see like the savings rate declining. So it's technology plus the relentless march of capitalism plus kind of generational turnover. I mean, the people who were in charge 20 years ago kind of grew up before having personal computers as like children, right? But like my generation grew up in an area where you have a computer, you have video game systems, right? You have the internet, and so less phobic of analytics.
Do you think it has stopped, or will it continue, the idea of disintermediation? This was one of the great promises of the internet, that you could get away from giant bureaucratic corporations or service providers, and you could individualize everything. You clearly individualize your career. The whole idea of Moneyball and everything like that is that, you know, some weirdo working in a paper bag factory in Lawrence, Kansas or something can come up with a better way to do things and then have a major impact that completely changes an industry. In that case, Bill James in baseball analysis and things like that. Is that still happening, or did it happen and now it stops?
I mean, it's happening in some fields. I worry about it like a little bit in media, where, look, I love Substack. It's been very good move in terms of both lifestyle and finances and whatever else. But it's kind of this thing where if you have an established brand, it's great. And if you don't, maybe that's wrong. Maybe there are like some niche communities that develop. Actually, maybe I take that back. Probably It's easier to get famous on a Substack on your own than going through like the farm system of like, you know, the Buffalo News and the Rochester Post-Gazette, and you get to the New York Post, the New York Times. Like, I guess maybe that's better.
Well, say somebody like Heather Cox Richardson, who's one of the most highly subscribed people at Substack, who's an academic. Nobody really knew who she was before Substack, right?
Yeah, there are fewer gatekeepers, I would say. I think mostly for better, but maybe also for worse.
What's a case where that's worse? And because that's the Village is kind of it's a place of gatekeepers, right?
I mean, if you go through like the top 50 U.S. politics Substacks, or there's some wacky ones, I would say, right? But I think on balance, it's better. And it also kind of gives the market a response to when the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Village are shutting out points that like people want to hear. You know, I mean, but yeah, I mean, the market, I don't know. I feel like, again, the market is efficient at meeting demand. Maybe you don't want to meet demand because people have, like, frankly, quite weird demands. It's one thing you learn in Vegas, for example. But the market's very efficient at meeting demands, and there are kind of fewer rules and fewer barriers, and kind of as the river becomes more ascendant potentially. I mean, look at AI, for example. You know, if you believe the people developing AI, it's like the most important technology in terms of existential impact on society potentially since like nuclear weapons were developed.
Well, let's talk a little bit about AI, because in the book you talk about Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI. He seems to be a pretty good citizen of the river. Can you talk about what is he doing right, you know, from your point of view?
Well, he certainly understands risk and reward. So I talked to Sam in mid-2022. I tried to get another interview with him after GPT 3.5 came out, then GPT 4, which were kind of the breakthrough products. He's like, I'm traveling the world. You can ask me a couple questions over email, right? And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to make do with this interview from like 2022, which was actually better because back then he was more candid and less reserved. And he's like, yeah, I think that, sure, there's a chance, I'm paraphrasing, do not take this as an exact quote, right? He's like, sure, there's a chance that it could kill everybody, but it could also be really, really good, and the good outweighs the bad, right? Like, that's a very Riverian mindset. We can debate the flaws in that, but like, but he understands that.
That is a good position, right? Or not specifically about AI, but there are people who would say if there is any chance that something can be bad, we should just shut it down. That's
well, I mean, there are all these philosophical debates about what if you face a truly existential risk that you can't recover from, should you weigh that at infinity or kind of some very large number, which I think is a complicated argument, but I think is not the worst heuristic and like, yeah, look, I don't know that like anybody should have the power to develop a technology that has a tangible chance, by their own admission, of like destroying civilization. So in the book, I propose this option where if you have a power to press a button and permanently shut down any further AI development. So we get to keep GPT-4, but no more progress from there. Would you press the button? If you don't press the button, by the way, this is important, you get the option after 10 years. The option to press the button turns back on. And I said I wouldn't press the button for a couple of reasons. And one is that I don't think I have the right, as a rich Westerner, to turn off technological growth for the rest of society, right? If everyone lives like it's Denmark, right, and they have like bike paths everywhere, and that's fine. If everyone's living at 70K euro a year standard of living, then okay, we've achieved maybe not the highest form of human evolution, but I don't think I have the right to stop that unless you can be confident there's an urgent problem that needs to be fixed now. And in general, technological growth has been substantially good for human beings. And this is one thing I think people, I took an economic history class in college. Actually, it's the worst grade I ever got because I thought the final was on a Thursday when it was on a Tuesday. Other way around, not a problem, right? You think it's anyway. But like people don't understand the history of progress and growth, and that the human condition is much better than it was 100 years ago, or certainly 500 or 1,000 years ago. And so it's a strong prior growth good to overcome.
One of the people who is, I wouldn't say you create heroes and villains in this book, but if you do, Sam Bankman-Fried, the head of, known as SBF, the head of FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange that turned out to be a massive kind of Ponzi scheme or fraud, he's one of them. What features made Sam Bankman-Fried part of the River?
Well, he was involved in everything, right? He was involved in crypto. He was getting VC funding. He actually got involved, wanted to get involved in sports betting. He was an investor in Anthropic, which is one of the leading AI labs now. Was also involved in politics. He wanted to become president and seriously thought he had a chance to become president. Look, I think the metaphor for Sam is that he kind of like hacked the River's algorithm in different ways. Because he would go to investor meetings and be like playing video games during investor meetings. People like, oh, it's so authentic, this like Spectrum-y nerd, right? He must be very authentic. He's like the new Mark Zuckerberg. There was a lot of like fear of missing out from Silicon Valley investors, especially in the category of crypto, which is seen as kind of foreign and weird. A lot of the leading crypto proprietors are Chinese or foreign. Here's this nerdy MIT kid who seems like a relatively safe investment. But yeah, look, anytime that people take shortcuts in terms of saying, okay, and by the way, if you talk to any VCs, the thing they're most worried about is the one who got away. They're like, oh, I could have invested in Google and gotten 10,000 maximum return, but I didn't like this guy, and they feel guilty about it for the rest of their life. And so,
when you say he hacked the algorithm, part of it is he clearly tapped into that, right? Where VCs, instead of like, let me see your numbers, it was all hunch with him.
It was, one VC I spoke with asked for the numbers and they didn't send them.
Right.
But again, in Silicon Valley, you have an asymmetric payoff matrix where in principle, you only can lose one time your money, whereas you can get paid back infinity, basically, or 5,000 times your money, 10,000 times you invested in Google early on. So in some ways, they don't care. Alfred Lin of Sequoia Capital said, I would make the same investment again, even with the benefit of hindsight, which is kind of a very honest response.
Right. Is that a stupid response, though?
Given his objective function, it's probably not. It's probably very honest, right?
Right. It's really interesting kind of narrative writing when you talk about going to meet SBF, who by the time you get there, he's already, the empire is crumbling. Can you talk about what it was like going to meet him, and how did he strike you as somebody who is interested in analysis but also understands, how people create characters that pay off?
So I get a little car. So I'm staying at Baha Mar, which is this giant casino resort, one of two very nice casino resorts in the Bahamas. His compound is on the other side of the island. It's not a huge island, but it's 45 minutes, maybe 35 minutes away by a taxi. It's kind of isolated, and you get in, security people are very hush-hush, right? And then it's a little bit like getting to like the Wizard of Oz. Is he in a castle or whatever? Or
I guess.
a mansion? I don't know.
He's behind a curtain, we know that.
Right, so it's a little bit, so I get there, and there's this woman who's like his press wrangler, and I expected like someone super organized. Instead, she was the wife or girlfriend of FTX's head of data science, who was the only remaining FTX employee, who had come to the Bahamas because she was like super woke and had studied small island anthropology. And small islands actually have it really tough. They're very isolated, so they're very dependent on the tourist trade or one particular commodity or the ships coming in. So they do actually get over all the time. And she wanted to make sure that all these other people fled the moment that they declared bankruptcy. She wanted to make sure, a very honorable thing to do, that the Bahamas was made whole as to the extent they could be. But she's an anthropologist, and now she's serving as like his press secretary, and she was like, I didn't like your post about COVID during the pandemic, Nate, but that's okay, I trust you. And then Sam is sleeping. It's like, well, we're gonna send Sam's mother to wake him up. In the meantime, I think we had some like lentil stew or something that Sam's mother, that was the next day. I ate like some of Sam's mom's food, which was just kind of weird. But it's a very surreal experience because you see how isolated that is. You might think, oh, Bahamas is an hour from Miami, but you're in a part of the island where there's like not really anything to do, so you're eating all your meals and everything is within this, I don't want to call it a cult, that's a strong term, but he had very little outside advice. His girlfriend ran his hedge fund, his parents worked for him, and if you're worth supposedly $15-20 billion, then people are very much a sycophant to you, so they're not going to give you good and honest advice. And so he had also poor impulse control, but he was enabled by a lot of people.
I guess one of the questions is the village is the group or the system that would rein him in, but they really didn't do that, right? And he was busy spending a lot of money to buy politicians who would actually change regulations or create regulations to his favor, but not other crypto people. What can you talk about, like the saga of SBF? Does it show, either that, markets work or markets don't work, or, what is a big moral that we might draw from that episode?
I mean, look, there is such a thing as having too much trust and having these kind of like, we talk about like, snowballs of distrust and disinformation. It's just like a snowball of trust. That first of all, Sam is in good with the effective altruists, who are all these very well coiffed, like Oxford professors and things like that. So they're vouching for him. Sequoia Capital, one of the top firms in Silicon Valley, is vouching for him. And once you get that, it's like you're part of a club, and more people keep vouching for you, right? He's doing the World Economic Forum, and he's getting the invites to the Met Gala, and he's kind of like the next big thing, shooting commercials with Steph Curry and Tom Brady, and at that point, it's kind of impossible to because he's saying very dangerous things. He went on the Odd Lots podcast, a very good Bloomberg podcast, and told Matt Levine, their financial reporter, I basically want to build a Ponzi coin, right? Yeah, there's no ultimate value, but people won't figure it out until it's too late. He told Tyler Cowen, the economist, that if I could press a button repeatedly to spend double or nothing stakes in the world, 50% of the time the world's destroyed, but if it's not destroyed, the world is 2.01x times as good. And as a strict utilitarian, it says I have to press the button. So I would just keep pressing that button over and over. It's a positive expected value bet. Like, this is insane. And he's saying this out loud, and it's a bystander effect where people are afraid to point out that he's saying. There were lots and lots of warning signs, including, by the way, in my own reporting. I talked to him first in like January 2022. And kind of when you're doing an initial kind of strafing of different things for the book, and like I was a little wacky, he talks really fast. I've seen this kind of weird nerd before, right? Smart guy. And then you go back and he's saying like all these crazy things. He told me that unless you're willing to like literally risk it all, that you're being too risk averse. Because most people would say, Elon Musk can spend $50 billion on Twitter and run it into the ground, or I think he's actually had a lot of cultural and political influence from Twitter, frankly. I'm not so sure it's a bad cultural investment. But if he loses that, he's still worth $170 billion dollars. He's not really taking very much risk at all in that sense. And Sam Bankman-Fried is saying, no, you have to literally be willing to ruin your reputation and destroy your life. That's the only way to maximize your expected value. And maximizing expected value is the only honorable way to live your life, basically.
And I guess when you talk to him next, he'll be like, yeah, I'll make the same choices, right? Just like the guy at Sequoia Capital.
He might. I mean, he didn't show much reflection at any point.
If he kind of represents what can go wrong on the river, what can go wrong in the village.
Not everyday stuff, but some of the chilling of free speech, I think, is pretty bad. I think you had a kind of near miss where Joe Biden was a Democratic nominee until July, and it was obvious that this is a terrible idea and that he's going to lose to Trump, number one, and that he can't consistently complete sentences. And an emperor has no clothes moment where you're not allowed to say this without being ostracized. I mean, and even now I think Biden's had some residual effects that make Kamala Harris's life harder, but those are just kind of from the past 5 years roughly.
All right, we're going to get started in just a second, taking questions from the audience, and somebody will bring a microphone. But to start this off, I'm going to ask a question. Nate, who is going to win the 2024 presidential election?
There is a 47.2% chance that Kamala Harris wins and a 52.5% chance that Donald Trump. Look, we had, first of all, Trump wins the ties because the Electoral College, if the popular vote is tied Harris +1 or Harris +2, he wins. It's a lot easier to lose a football game when the other team gets a free field goal, basically. The incumbent president is very unpopular. Typically, when incumbent presidents are very unpopular and they win for re-election, then they lose. Democrats had the clever idea of tagging him out, which has definitely improved the situation, but all around the world, incumbent parties are losing. There's been, I think, a backlash against some of the excesses of 2019 and 2020, and Kamala Harris is someone who represented some of those excesses. So there are all these kind of fundamental, kind of glacial factors that work against her. And yet it's a toss-up.
How do you deal with people getting mad at you because you're bringing news that they don't like to hear?
Again, if for every person that gets mad at me on Twitter, I get an annual paid Substack subscriber, then I'll take that deal every time.
Very good. All right, let's open it up for questions. Let's go right up here.
Hi, my name is Christopher. I work in Democratic politics, so I apologize on behalf of my brethren for the replies in your tweets the past few years. I was talking to my colleagues today that was coming to this event, and I wanted to get a sense of you offer probability of elections, but you also occasionally offer analysis. I think I'm a proud Silver Bulletin subscriber. You should subscribe as well. You recently offered analysis about how Kamala was presenting herself on her website. What informs your worldview on your analysis? Is that probabilistic thinking, or is that just Nate Silverism?
It's just a person who reads a lot and has a lot of weird life experience, and yeah, I think the whole brand of data-driven, data is a tool to be correct about the world, and it's not the only tool to be correct about the world. You can use your eyes and ears and talk to people and be networked and have the weird set of experiences that I've had, and also it's an advantage to not really give if you offend people. If you're someone that Democrats read and you don't if you offend neurotic Democrats, and you can write really good stuff, right? Because you're uninhibited, and you're staking out ground that maybe people aren't really going into as much. I mean, if you read kind of the analyses of why is Harris in a toss-up election, either it's, well, she's the worst candidate of all time, which is not. I think she's a pretty good candidate. Or it's it's because the New York Times is too mean to Joe Biden, which is the most deluded thing I've maybe ever heard in my life, right? And because I think the Biden-Harris administration made what in retrospect looked like mistakes with respect to, probably the level of government spending. They were able to keep the labor market very afloat, which is a big accomplishment, but at the price of very high inflation for a few years. The border was quite lax for a few years. I think Democrats are lucky that people are not judging Biden based on foreign policy because the world is less safe than it was 4 years ago. This is not, by the way, a recommendation that Trump would make it more safe. It's just saying that like there are a lot of logical reasons why, and the fact that like people are perpetually negative. I mean, to the extent that like news coverage matters, it's because we always accentuate, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. People who are using algorithms understand that playing into people's anxieties click better than making people happy, actually, and it's kind of hard to have the good news stories. Now things are pretty good, right? It's absolutely true that like inflation makes more news when it's on the rise than when it's on the decline. But still, that's a nuanced perspective that I think you get from someone who just spent a long time studying this and is not like aligned in any one like faction necessarily.
Okay. Next question.
I really jive with your the river versus the village, and I'm wondering, is it possible to be someone in between? Because it seems like we're living in a world where you're either, there's this, my friend calls it like hive mind or anti-hive mind, and shouldn't the world be somewhere in between? How do we get there? Who's there? Please answer.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously you can be in between. I mean, I fancy myself a Rivarian, but like I work for a big New York publisher and I freelance for the New York Times and I went to the University of Chicago. Oh, University of Chicago is a little bit weird. It's maybe not quite as villagey as other schools. But no, you want to be both, I think. I mean, because these communities do not understand one another, I don't think, very well at all. The village, or the river rather, often has like rather poor instincts for politics. And like I know, the rapidness of when someone gets into politics for the first time. And
did you ever go through a phase like that?
Maybe a little. I went through kind of a phase where I was like friendly with a lot of like, because I started out as an anonymous blogger on like Daily Kos, and like I got into some of that.
Which is a far left-wing, a progressive site back in the.
I mean, I think the good thing was that like this is in 2006 when they banned poker, Congress bans poker, online poker, through 2008. This is like a time of like a really big tent coalition because Bush is extremely unpopular. So leftists, centrists, liberals, eccentrics, all around this big anti-Bush coalition, and the internet back in these days is like a friendlier and nerdier place by virtue of being on the internet and writing about politics on the internet. You're being somewhat self-selecting. So it was a really happy time, I think, to be in politics. And so for that reason, I think I maybe got less of that than I otherwise would. I remember the first big falling out I had was after 2009, where Obama was trying to pass Obamacare, and Joe Lieberman's being Joe Lieberman, difficult about different things, right? He refuses to sign off on like a public option, for example, and so there's progressives saying, okay, no public option, then kill the bill, and I wrote a post saying that's insane, right? Just because you can't get everything you want doesn't mean you should therefore throw out the things that you do want that are still pretty good if you're a progressive and wants more health insurance coverage. And so that was kind of the first falling out. But there was a period when it was kind of like kumbaya in the left and center. That's since passed us.
Next question.
Hi, I wanted to ask a very basic question. So we asked about who you thought would win in the games. Who you think would win in this race? Why am I asking this? Because in my understanding, for whatever reason, official polls tend to underestimate Trump's success. So we discussed some of the reasons as to why he may be popular, but why do you think the polls underestimated generally? And if so, why? And if not, why do you think there's ideas even out there that might be the case?
Good. Thank you.
So thank you. The polls underestimated Trump, obviously, in 2016 and 2020. If you talk to pollsters, they give somewhat different. I'm not a pollster, by the way. People call me that. I don't mind as a shorthand, but they give somewhat different reasons. In 2016, the official excuse is that the country became really polarized on educational lines. If you're college educated now, particularly advanced degrees, then you're more likely to vote Democratic. That's not a Trump demographic. But you're also much more likely to respond to survey. You're like, oh, I'm college educated. Survey, that sounds very exciting. It benefits the public to give my information. If you're a busy non-college working class person, then you don't trust the media organization testing surveys as much. So that's So polls used to have too many educated respondents, and now they weight W-E-I-G-H-T that away. They'd be like, okay, if we actually do find a non-college respondent, we'll count them double, basically, to match census demographics. In 2020, it may have been COVID related. That created a differential response rate. If you look at polls from before the pandemic really hit our shores, like February 2020, they're actually pretty accurate, right? They had like Wisconsin's 1 point, Michigan's 1 point. Biden gets this big surge that may have been caused by non-response bias. So depending on which of those explanations you believe might explain what happens this year. What I don't think is true is this notion that that like Trump supporters are shy and refuse to. They're not shy. It's not like Trump supporters are shy.
Right.
Exactly.
You also, in a recent New York Times story, you also talked about the revert or obverse of that, where there might be an undercount of Harris voters. Can you talk a little bit about where that idea comes from? And it may not be the case, but
it's plausible. There are a few different mechanisms. One is that, so increasingly, Democrats actually prefer lower turnout, that the marginal voters are mostly Trump voters, and the loyal, regular suburban voters are mostly Democrats. So, if the irregular voters don't turn out, maybe if Elon Musk's turnout operation proves to be a failure, or they just don't seem to care that much, we're kind of in a less political climate than we were 4 years ago, that's one scenario. I don't know that anybody's doing a particularly good job of capturing the preferences of younger voters. Polls have shown a drop-off for Democrats among younger voters. If that's not true, then Harris could overperform. They've also shown a drop-off among Black and Hispanic voters. If that proves to be exaggerated, maybe the Black voters you're getting on the phone are not representative, then she could overperform. But the argument is mainly about the kind of incentives in the polling industry and the fact that like polls are not so much like surveys of public opinion anymore, but like models with like data flavored characteristics. I think most pollsters are pretty honest, but it's also like they probably live in fear of making the same mistake a third time in a row. Because in politics, in sports, you have a 3-game losing streak all the time, right? Yeah. In politics, where people treat every election as the new iron law of politics, if you up in the same way 3 times in a row, then 3 strikes and you. Although I don't know, you still see polls. We'll still see polls no matter what. People just have this fascination with trying to predict the outcome. But yeah, it would be that there's a lot of fear and uncertainty about missing low on Trump. That the problems in 2016 and 2020 may have been fixed, and so therefore they're making conservative assumptions. Is it likely? You don't need that much of a polling error for one candidate to win. If every state's within 1 point, and polls are off by an average of 3.5 points historically, and usually in the same direction, right? In 2016, Hillary Clinton underperformed in almost every swing state. So there's about a 40% chance that these 7 swing states, Georgia, North Carolina, I have to recite them, that one candidate sweeps all 7 states.
Well, hopefully we'll know in a couple of months who's president, right? So, next question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Quick question, as you recently joined Polymarket as an advisor, just curious to hear your take, the way you see prediction markets and their impact on society as a whole in the coming years.
So for society, it's good because now when people are bull, then you can make money off their bull, right? If you think that Republicans are just drinking the Kool-Aid, you can't bet on Polymarket in the U.S., I should specify that. Well, there are others. Kalshi opened up to U.S. trading. So if there are people who have a lot of conviction, and the gambling world revolves around whales, as we call them. Whales are people with a high propensity to spend large amounts of money in negative EV, negative expected value wagers. And there's evidence that at Polymarket you have a few traders, or maybe one trader with different pseudonyms, who has bet something on the order of like $40 or $50 million on Trump, and will buy up the Trump contract when it gets too low. Look, in the context of Wall Street, that's not that much money. In the context of prediction markets, which are a rapidly growing but still growing industry, you need a lot of people who just want to bet $500 on Harris or something to make up for $40 million in equity, and so the markets aren't quite robust enough to cover for that. But still, I think they're a big improvement. Like during the debates, for example, the markets figured out very, very quickly that the first debate was bad, was really bad for Biden. I figured out after about like 6 minutes. And the second debate, they kind of figured out once you started talking about abortion and Harris was better on that issue, it figured out it would probably be good for Harris and kind of prices in almost instantly the correct amount of gains in her poll. So for events like that, I think they're really valuable. I think when you do have good models, I think the models are better, I'll just say that. But I think they're a valuable tool. They let businesses hedge different types of financial risk as well. And I don't know, I think it's better when people have skin in the game and bear consequences for being wrong. Financial consequences.
People are increasingly talking about prediction markets kind of replacing or supplementing polls. Do you, should we take it as a given that if both polls and prediction markets are going in the same direction, they must be correct?
That's wrong-headed. I mean, because you need to be able to touch. This is one thing I worry about, by the way, in like a virtual AI world. You need to be able to touch grass, right? There's one from us like we're going to survey AI people that we create and do a poll that way. It's like that's the stupidest idea that I've ever heard, right? You need like raw inputs. You can't just have a process of a facsimile of a facsimile of a facsimile. And there can be these spirals where. So let's say that that this whale on Polymarket. Let's just say that he's not even. I assume it's a he, probably. Let's assume that he just as really has a lot of conviction in Trump and whatever. $40 million is not that much, maybe, if you're a billionaire or something. And so he makes these trades. Polymarket first moves all the other prediction markets, and then it maybe starts to move the actual markets and other derivative markets from that, right? And then he influences the narrative, and then and then you hear people talking about Polymarket, and it kind of feels like you're hearing. Have you ever told a friend a rumor, and then you meet them for a beer a month later, and they're like, "Did you hear this rumor about a person X?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I've been hearing that everywhere." It's like, "Oh, I probably told them that, and they forgot it was me who told them that," and then they bring it back to me, and now it feels like there's a cluster of everyone in my life has this rumor, it must be true, which the same information being regurgitated. And so I think people need to be, I'll put it like this. I think that, if I were betting, then I would take Harris at at 37%. I think that's a good bet. I think it's almost a 2-to-1 underdog. I think she's going to win the election 45% of the time, right? It's not the way most people think about it, but I think it's become mispriced.
Yeah. We are out of time. Nate Silver, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, guys.
Again, the book is On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything. I'd also like to thank everyone who asked a question here today. And finally, a big thank you to you, the audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate.